So this morning we continue our series in thinking about our own spirituality and how that makes us or doesn't make us better neighbors. And in thinking about that, I got a little bit nostalgic because last weekend I wasn't here. I was on the East Coast. My son is looking at colleges. We were in New York City and we were in Washington, D.C. And when I was young, we moved around a lot as a family. My dad's job had us moving every 4 to 6 years. But probably the most formative space that I was in for my childhood, that kind of formed my understanding of my childhood, was outside of Washington, D.C. in Springfield, Virginia. And so being back in D.C. and telling my son some stories about every time visitors were in town and we had to go down to the mall and show them the whole deal. And but my probably age 10 or age 5 to age 10, right around in there, was when we lived in Springfield, Virginia, and my address was 811 Everett Drive. 811 Everett Drive was my universe. And I would, on a regular basis, starting in the morning before I was really kind of locked into school, but then even after school would happen, after school, I just kind of went loose in the neighborhood. You remember in the days when kids were just kind of like feral cats? They just kind of went wherever, and that's what we did. We just went wherever, and you went over fences and other people's backyards, and you were down at the end of the street, and we played at this end of Cromwell Drive. We played stickball in the street, which sounds kind of dangerous, but we did on a regular basis. This side of Cromwell Drive, there was a hill, and so when we would get the occasional snowfall, everyone would head out there in their toboggans, and we would go way too fast and down the street, and people would yell car and watch out. I mean, it was really dangerous, and a lot of the things that we did probably wouldn't be necessarily smiled upon today, but it was how life was lived. And from the beginning of the day in the summertime till the end of the night, I was just out roaming the neighborhood. And I can think about the many hours my sister and I spent with our friends in our backyard or in one of our friends' backyards or in our front yards, like just creating these universes. Remember that? Like this whole alternate reality. And we would have roles, and we would have other people that we were interacting with that either existed or didn't exist, and we would create these elaborate structures mostly made out of twigs and cardboard boxes or whatnot. I mean, it was just where we lived our lives. Can you guys remember at that age of your life where you lived? And maybe some of you grew up in apartments, but what your house looked like, what your hallway looked like, what your street looked like. Do you remember the address of where you were that feral kid running around, learning about life and interacting with others? I also can remember our neighbors pretty clearly. And as you face front, looking out at Cromwell Drive. I forgot to mention Trafalgar Court. They were the mean kids. And that was the parallel street behind us, and we would have these epic games of capture the flag with Cromwell Drive kids versus Trafalgar Court kids, and it was quite a battle back and forth. But but on Cromwell Drive, our neighbors to the right, how would I describe them? They were a mystery. They were absent. I don't know how they got in and out of their house, but I know they had kids, but somehow they got in and they got out, and their schedules just didn't mesh with the rest of us, but you just didn't see them. They weren't present. But I remember looking through the chain link fence into their backyard, and it was this wilderness, like unkempt and tangled in bushes and trees, and they didn't have grass like us, but they did have a family of possums that lived, and that terrified me and intrigued me at the same time. And I remember standing at the fence watching these creepy things. And so that was our neighbors to our right, kind of mystery, a little bit weird, absent. And then straight behind us were the Feingolds. The Feingolds had 2 kids that were a little bit younger than us, and I don't know if the adults in that family had many rules for the kids. It seemed like they didn't. And if anybody did make the rules, it was the kids. So the Feingold kids were always in the backyard doing whatever, and I always thought they were kind of naughty, but they were always the ones that would tell on us when we did things. My sister and I would be in the backyard doing something that we thought was innocuous, and all of a sudden, Mr. and Mrs. Feingold would be in their backyard talking across the fence to us because we had done something that had offended their children. We'd kind of roll our eyes. And then as soon as they went back in the house, their kids would grab sticks and poke at our dog through the fence. And you know the Feingolds? You guys ever have Feingolds near you? Yeah. And then across the street and over was this couple, and I don't remember their names, but they had the most beautiful and immaculate house and yard. And every weekend, they would be out on their yard weeding, trimming, edging, fertilizing, and I wrote it down. It was called the Annual Lawn Beauty Contest. And guess who won that award every year on Cromwell Drive? Beautiful house, beautiful lawn. However, if you were out as a feral child like me, playing in the street, and the stickball went into their yard, there was this moment of trepidation where you stood at the curb and you tried to decide who was going to make the run into the yard to get the ball and back out, because somehow, not only did they have an immaculate yard, they had some sort of warning system that whenever a child was on their lawn, somebody came to the window or to the front door and yelled at that child to get off of our yard. You couldn't even go onto their driveway. Beautiful, stunning house, stunning people, as I recall, not very nice. And then you had neighbors, like the couple that was right across the street from us and their kids, and down the street, their names were the Gans and the Dunbracks. And you probably had Gans and Dunbracks on your street. And the thing is about the Gans and the Dunbracks is I can remember parts of their houses, their front porch, and their backyard as well as I can remember mine. It was as if our house and front yard just kind of moved right into theirs. And sometimes when I was outside and I would fall off my bike and wipe out, or I was crying about this or that, and my mom or dad weren't around, it would be Mr. Dunbrack or it would be Mrs. Gann or one of the older Dunbrack kids that would come out, and they would ask me what was up, and they would help me out, and they would get me going, and they were kind of like extra parents and family that were just there, right? And every time you would find yourself playing in their yard and they came out into the front porch, they wouldn't yell, "Get off my yard." They would say, "Hey, what are you playing? That looks like a great game. Make sure you're safe," right? Those kind of neighbors. I knew their kitchens because their kitchens were the places where kids would just kind of gather, 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 of us. And I don't know why we all were there, but there would be a kitchen table, and we'd be sitting around it, and there would be Kool-Aid, really bad for you, didn't quench your thirst at all, but there was always a pitcher of Kool-Aid, right? And then peanut butter and jelly squares that you cut up into triangles, right? That was our communion. And at the Dunbracks and the Gans, and at my house, I'd like to think, it was just always available. It was just a safe place when you knew you were in their yards or in their front yards or backyards, in their homes. The thing that I remember probably kind of that sticks in my mind right before we moved out of that house was this incident where a number of the kids who were older, like my brother is about 4.5 years older than me, a number of them had somehow, there had been, like one of the parents was out of town and there had been a house party or something like that. I wasn't invited, I was a little kid. And there had been a lot of alcohol and they were smoking stuff and they got busted. And all of a sudden it was like all the phones were getting picked up and neighbors' parents were calling each other and talking and rumors were going around and accusations and what happened. And I remember it was the Dunbracks, the family down the street. And Mr. Dunbrack was one of those guys where when they were building the tree fort in the back, he actually took input from the other kids in the block. What would you like to have? And when we always played stickball right in front of their house. And when your ball would go off into their yard or hit their house, you'd be like, "Nice shot! That was a heck of a line drive." And it was the Dunbracks who I remember said to all the parents, "How about this? How about we get together at our house in the living room this one evening?" And I remember walking down the street with my parents, my brother super sheepishly, my sister and I walking down the street. My parents went into the house and into the living room to have the conversation. All the kids were just kind of in the front yard, just kind of wondering what was going to happen. And they had this conversation. They sat around and they diffused some of the rumors that were not true and some of the facts that had been passed around as facts that weren't factual, who was there and what had happened and what was involved. And then they began to talk about what are we going to do, not just as individual families, but as a block. How are we going to parent each other's kids? And they didn't all agree. It was a hard conversation. I remember there were some parents who had really one idea and other parents had other ideas as to how, but they stuck at it. And I remember being on that front lawn longer than we kind of wanted to be, and finally the parents started to come back out and grab their kids by the hands and head home, and they had come up with a plan. And we didn't necessarily like the plan, but what we did know is that those adults cared about us. And they cared enough about kids that weren't their kids that they sat down and had hard conversations about things and bridged gaps and came up with some new understandings of rules. Do you guys remember the neighbors in your neighborhood growing up when you were a kid? Do you remember the weird folks, the annoying ones? Do you remember the ones that were absent and weren't there at all? Remember the ones that were beautiful lawns but not necessarily the nicest people? And do you remember the Dunbracks and the Gans, right? When it comes to understanding in our interaction with other people and neighborhoods and that, it's easier for us to be able to assess what kind of neighbors people are. When it comes to ourselves and our own spirituality, it's been interesting as a pastor for a number of years now. When we think about our own goodness as Christians, and whether we are good Christians or our faith is efficacious, if it has formed us, it's interesting that when I will ask people on a regular basis, hey, would you be willing to be a small group leader in this, or would you be willing to help out with that, or would you be willing to help out and lead in worship or to serve communion? Typically the response I get is, oh, no. Because the way we judge our own spirituality, and if we're good Christians, the way we measure Christianness in our own minds typically has to do with two things, which I've always found kind of odd, but it has to do with knowledge and attendance. Oh, I haven't been to church in a while. Oh boy, I don't know, when's the last time I went to Sunday school, Paul? You shouldn't ask me to do that. Or I don't even know if you had me, is Hezekiah a book? I don't even know. If you asked me to read from Hezekiah, I wouldn't even know where to find it. And it's funny, when we think about our own spirituality, we tend to think in terms of attendance or knowledge. All of these kind of simplistic things, yes, they're important, but really don't have a whole lot to do with how it is that God talks about us and our faith and what it means to be a good Christian. It's interesting that our measure of ourselves, when it comes to our own goodness or Christianness, doesn't necessarily add up to the way that we view other people's goodness or neighborliness. We actually are not measured as good Christians if we know every book in the Bible. Not that that isn't a good thing to know, that's fine. We're not measured as to whether we are good Christians or our faith is formative in our lives if we are in worship 2 or 3 or 4 times a month. We all know we're not perfect. We share that in common. So when it comes down to it, how do we measure whether we are good Christians or not, whether this faith of ours is having an effect on our lives? Here's the thing. Here's the thing about being somebody who seeks to follow and to be more like Jesus of Nazareth. It really doesn't matter how we grade ourselves. It really doesn't matter how often you come to church. I'm glad that you do come to worship. It doesn't matter if you got a Sunday school pin because you're in Sunday school every Sunday. If you go, I think you probably learn good things. I think that's great. It doesn't matter whether you can recite the books of the New Testament. Whether if you can, I think that's great. If you read the Bible, I think that's good. That really doesn't have anything to do with how we measure whether we are good Christians or not. The way we measure our faith is through the eyes of our neighbors. What do your neighbors say about you? What do your classmates say about you? What do your coworkers say about you? What do the people that you volunteer with on a regular basis, what do they say about you? What kind of effect do you have on others? Because you know what? They will know we are Christians. Help me out. By our love, yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. Not our attendance, not our knowledge. Friends, if we want to measure whether our faith is having an effect on our lives, ask your neighbors what kind of neighbor you are. Ask your friends, ask your classmates, ask your coworkers if you are a loving person, and then listen to them. If we each were to go home this afternoon or on Monday into work or into the classroom, and we walked around and we handed out little surveys to people up and down our block or in our classrooms or in the cubicles next to us, those people that we work with on a regular basis, asking them to give us feedback on what kind of a person we are, what kind of a neighbor we are. And yes, you have to give it to the annoying kid and to the older grump. You've got to give it to the busy parents and the bachelors who live down the street. What would they say about you? What kind of reflections and reactions would the people down your hallway say about you and the kind of neighbor you are? Because Jesus really didn't make it that hard. We like to think that Jesus made it hard. We like to think that this faith of ours is hard. But really, when Jesus got together with his disciples and he said, I'm out of here, I've got to move on, I will be with you, but in a different way, I want to give you just one thing to do, right? What did he say? Little children, I'm here with you just a little while longer. This is from John 13, as Jesus is at the final supper with his disciples. You'll look for me, but just as I told the Jewish leaders, I will tell you now where I'm going. You can't come. So, since you can't come with me, this is what I need you to do. I need you to do what I have been doing. I need you to embody the gospel. I give you a commandment. Here it is. 3 words. Say it with me. Love each other. That's it. That's it. If that was the litmus test, if that was the question you had to ask your neighbors, your coworkers, do I practice this? What would folks say about you? My assumption is, my hope is that they would say, yeah, most of the time or all the time. Just as I have loved you, so you also must love each other. This is how everyone will know that you are my disciples, when you love one another. That's it. That's the measure, folks. If you can come to church more often, if you can read your Bible, if you can memorize, that's fantastic. I got to tell you this, though. As a pastor, in my 20-some years of being a pastor, I have to tell you that some of the people that are the most adamant about our kids need to be in Sunday school and people should be memorizing Scripture are not the most loving people. That's the end goal, folks. The reason you go to Sunday school, the reason you come to church, the reason you volunteer, the reason you go to Bishop Spencer, the reason that you read the Scripture is so that you become more and more loving. And so when people ask what kind of a person you are, people more and more say, oh my gosh, that Jennifer Nelson, that Jeff Schrader, they're loving. I mean, I know they're not perfect. In another place, Jesus says it this way. He's getting together with religious leaders and a lawyer. In both Luke and Mark's gospel, the same story is told. A lawyer, which means someone who's well-versed in the Scriptures, because the law was the Torah, right? So as a Jewish scholar, knew the answers, came to Jesus and said, tell us, what's the one thing we should do if we want to be good religious people, if we want to be good followers of Yahweh? And Jesus says, here you go. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do that. Love yourself. Love yourself. Love God. And allow those two things then to flow over so that you're loving other people. Interesting thing is, though, right? What we like to do, all of us good lawyers, I want to tell you, that's a simple answer. And I would guess each one of us, if someone said you need to be more loving, we know what that means. But what do we want to do? Well, let me clarify that a little bit more. I know you said we have to love each other, but let's just parse a couple of the verbs or the nouns. Let's get into the nitty-gritty, because if we can get into the nitty-gritty, maybe we won't ever have to actually do anything. If we can just study and read another book and debate and discuss and try to decide what this actually means, then maybe I won't have to do all those things that I know are going to be uncomfortable, are going to pull me outside of my comfort zone, are going to be risky. And so the young lawyer says, so let's just talk about, what do you mean, neighbor? And Jesus is like, fine, you want to go there? All right, here we go. So Jesus tells a story about that guy right there. He tells a story about a man who is brutalized and robbed and left by the side of a road, and it did not look at all like that. I love that Tiffany window. But first of all, they weren't white. Second of all, there was no flowers. It was in the middle of a dusty, dirty passage between Jericho and Jerusalem. In the springtime, there might have been some cactus and some flowering. But anyways, that looks a lot more like Florence and like the Powell Gardens, like if they had a baby. But anyways, it's beautiful. But that is a man who was brutalized and left for dead at the side of the road. Jesus says that happened. This guy is at the side of this dusty road, and two very good people walk by, and they know all the answers. They have excellent attendance at church. They know the books of the Bible front and back, and they come up with very good excuses as to why it is they should not stop and help this man. And then you know who walks by? A foreigner. One of those weirdos, those Samaritans. And he goes above and beyond. He gets off his horse, and he cares for the man, heals him. He walks him to an inn, and he leaves enough money so that person could be taken care of for the next few days, and then he checks back in on him later and pays his bills. Jesus says, you want to know what a neighbor is? That's your neighbor. Love one another. Love one another. Love yourselves, love God, and love your neighbors. It's that easy, and it's that difficult. You want to know if you're a good Christian, ask your neighbors what they think about you. To be a good neighbor is to love those that we share a street with, that we share a fence with, we share a hallway with, we share a room or an office with, but it also means to love those who aren't on our street, who don't come from our neighborhood. It means to get involved. To be a good neighbor is going to cost you. To be a good neighbor might even be dangerous. It will certainly be risky. And because of that, there will always, always, always be a very good excuse why it is that you shouldn't do it. Jesus' challenge to us is, yes, I know that. I hear your question. Let's press beyond that and love people anyway, in ways that are risky and vulnerable and cause us to get a little bit dirty. Love one another. The thing is, if we choose to truly take that seriously, to be good neighbors, to be a welcome and safe and healing kind of house or family or apartment or individual, it will, friends, put you at odds with those other neighbors who care more about being beautiful or safe or comfortable or increasing their property value. Those things are all good, and we can all relate to those things, but that is not our highest goal as followers of Jesus of Nazareth. We need to know what we're getting into when we say we're going to follow this man and love as he loved and to claim as neighbors those who he said are our neighbors. So here's my question. What kind of neighbor are you? What would your neighbors say about you? What would your classmates, what would your workmates say about you? What kind of neighbor are you? And so here's the thing. Sorry, this is a good point. I just didn't look at my notes. When I was growing up, one of the reasons why kids would come to our door and why I knew that I always could go to Mrs. Gann's door is because they had a star in the window. Do you guys remember this? Growing up, in Springfield, Virginia, if you put a star in your window, that meant you were a safe home. A hippie who was strung out on heroin, a kid who was lost or whatever, you could go to that door and someone's going to answer the door and be, how can I help you? That would be the question they would ask. And if you had a star in the window, you knew you could go there. And I remember one time coming home from school, and I wiped out on my bike, and I was nowhere near home, and I saw a house with a star, and I walked up there, and the person there took care of me. It was fantastic. It was wonderful. What I've seen more and more in our neighborhoods today are signs and windows that say this, right? This is important. It's important for us to have a neighborhood watch, but you just don't see signs like this anymore in people's windows, right? Our neighborhoods, or signs that say this, right? When we are primarily defined by we want to make sure we're safe and comfortable, then friends, some of the things that Christ calls us to be as neighbors and the risks that we're going to have to take become secondary or tertiary. It's going to be risky. It's going to be dangerous. It's going to cause us to cross over boundaries, allow people into our house that we might not necessarily want to, or at least on our front porches. but may we be known more as safe places and as places of help and rescue than places that are worried and watching. So the two questions I would have you ask yourselves are, what's the kind of person your neighbors would say you are and why? And what's one thing you can do this week, and then maybe another thing next week you can do to increase the chance that people would say that that person is someone who seeks to love others? Take those with you. And now, I want to put a challenge out to all of us before we gather around this kitchen table and are reminded by our God about what it means to be hospitable and to wash each other's feet and to love each other and feed each other, care for each other, cry together, and heal the world together. What about this? What if, think about this for a second, think of Kansas City. Just if you can, think of the map, the neighborhoods in your head. What if we could get families, individuals together who would agree on certain basic levels of kind of morality and what is good, and they could get together in different places, in different neighborhoods, in different parts of the city, and could come up with an agreement that we are going to be a safe place, we're going to be a safe group of people, we're going to be a loving presence in this part of the city, we're going to notice hurting people, we're going to provide support and care, we're going to be willing to have the hard conversations about those divisive or difficult topics and challenges that are facing our neighborhood. We're going to help to try to come across with good solutions. We're going to respect each other. And what if you could get groups of people to come together in different parts around our city, like every half mile or so, and they would gather there on a regular basis and do the best they could to bring safety and connection and healing and love? Wouldn't that be cool? I mean, you could literally cover the whole city with communities of people like that who got together that sought to be places of love and hope and healing and connection in their communities. And what about this? What if we called those groups, what if we called those communities church? What if that's what a church was? What if when we gathered here, we were as concerned about the things that are happening outside these walls and the things that are breaking God's heart in this neighborhood as we were concerned about each other, and we should be concerned about each other? What if churches and mosques and synagogues all through the city could see themselves as agents of safety and healing and hope and reconciliation in their neighborhoods? Wouldn't that be a good plan? Do you know whose plan that was? It is a good plan. Friends, and we're a part of it. Together, individually in your neighborhoods, here as we gather in this place, we are the agents of God's healing and reconciliation in the world. What do our neighbors say about us? And I hope that they say not just that we have a beautiful lawn, or that we don't bother people, but I hope they say that we love them, that we're here for them, that we're a church that steps outside of our houses, that we are people that step beyond our own lives and needs, and when we hear somebody crying, when we see a conflict taking place, we ask how we can help. We bring drinks to the thirsty and shelter for the weary and food for the hungry. How do you know if your faith is real and strong and affecting your life and the life of those around you? What do your neighbors say about you? And what can you do today? What can we do today to make that answer, to make their response more in line with the things of Christ? They are a community that seeks to love one another. She is a person that seeks to love others. May it be so in all of us. Amen.